I had not had experience with gender specific spaces kind of before I converted to Catholicism, which was actually after I left college. But one of the things that I noticed and appreciated was it allowed me to like accept that there are parts of how I see the world or how I act that are common to like men in general.
Mhm.
It was my kind of experience that growing up, always being around men and women, everything seems super malleable, or they're just, everyone seems to be doing something a little bit different. And then when you kind of get a concentrated amount of men, or I would imagine a concentrated amount of women, you get to be like, oh, like we just all, we all want to get up to mischief, or we all want to compete. Like it's not just a me thing. This is something that kind of men in general experience, which was definitely a good thing for me to be able to acknowledge.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that, there's a lot of kind of animosity between the sexes right now, whether it be talking about, toxic masculinity, or a lot of, I think, men online that are more like quote unquote red pilled, being very pessimistic about the state of women today.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that oftentimes those things just kind of come out from not being able to actually properly separate the two, and to kind of acknowledge like these are the things that men need to work on and these are the things that women need to work on, but almost like men and women are just one thing, or we're just human. And we are, but I think that that comes about in different ways. And that it's important to kind of acknowledge those differences, like you said, to realize like actually it's not something that's wrong with me, it's just something that like is more particular to men, or more particular to women. I think one of the things that I've kind of, heard and read a little bit about is even just the effect that that's had in terms of like classrooms. So when classrooms started to be integrated, it was more difficult for the boys because, I think the standards that we set are more like, you're sitting and paying attention for a very long amount of time, or you have to, very diligently do assignments or homework. And a lot of guys don't necessarily learn that way. They learn maybe more by doing, or by debating, or asking more pointed questions, and maybe getting up to a little more ruckus. And whereas like women can be maybe more comfortable in those environments and excel in those environments. And it can be difficult because there are people that always break those exceptions, or break the rule in general. And that's not a bad thing. It's just we're all individuals and unique in that way. But you do see that now, kind of as those spaces have become more integrated, and to a certain sense kind of catering to women's needs, I think a little more, because you had these spaces that were more masculine, like universities that were only for men. And then you start to kind of shift that to accommodate women, and then that's not a bad thing. But you do see how now it's reached a point where men are kind of falling behind in those things. Women on average have higher grades and higher graduation rates. So it kind of, I think, goes to show like we shouldn't have this kind of uniform standard for both. There are some areas where that makes sense, but when you start to do that, I think it's easier to get into contention about like, men are failing or women are failing, when in reality we're just different. And that means that there's different things that can help us to excel better, to do better in school, or better in grades, that just kind of come down to being able to identify those differences, and cultivate a space where they can grow, and that they're not a bad thing. It's just about finding the proper way for those to try to interplay.
Mm-hmm. One of the maybe closest relationships that I would love to see more common between men is between mentors and mentees.
Mhm.
And when I talk to men, I see a lot of people go to kind of cultural mentors of, they'll talk about the Jordan Petersons, the Jocko Wellinks, the
Mhm.
David Goggins, these people that are inspiring them and motivating them maybe in a way that they haven't heard before. But one of the things that I loved from your story, where you said you kind of got that from New Polity, which was a more cultural mentor relationship, but
Mhm.
you also had your older brother, who was a more intimate mentor relationship. And that's really a key that I've seen lacking among men, is we can kind of provide as many cultural role models, and we should continue to provide more. But until there's really that intimate mentor that you can go to, there just isn't enough specificity for your situation. Since that relationship, like with your brother, have you made any other mentors as you've gone out into other social settings? And if so, how have you been able to do that, or what would you recommend to guys to be able to develop more of those relationships?
Yeah, so I think that the first one that comes to mind is Exodus. So oftentimes you might be doing it with people of different ages or in different, states of life. So it can depend completely on your parish and who's able to do it. Oftentimes it can just be a good experience to do with friends. But last year in my parish, I was in a group that was primarily with married men. So I think that that was really valuable because they were men that weren't too much older than me, maybe like less than a decade older. But we're still kind of in a different point in their lives where they were, one of them got engaged during Exodus and then married shortly after, or two others were married, one had a baby during Exodus. So I think it was just very helpful to kind of like have this space where like, it can be difficult to have kind of like not intergenerational, but like, friendships with people that are older than you and younger than you. So I think even in those spaces, it was really helpful to just kind of see like, okay, here are people that have, been in the workforce for a little bit longer, are in more serious committed relationships. Like, what are they looking for? What are they valuing? So I think that those guys, just by going on that experience, I learned a lot from them in terms of, how they, now years down the line were practicing their faith, how they had grown. They were able to speak about, their experiences in college and afterwards, and just kind of hearing tidbits from that. And even just being able to observe, like, their relationships with their spouses or their fiancés, to seeing them at mass or like seeing them at retreats, and just kind of being able to have people that were a little bit older but similar enough, and in a space where you could kind of talk about those things, or they would just share those things because that's where they were in life. So I think that those guys definitely helped a lot. I think the other thing too has just been, I think that priests can play a really big role in this. So Father Charlie at Immaculate Conception, I think, has also just been a good mentor in the sense that, like, he's a bit of a younger priest, but obviously older than me, and I think just being able to hear homilies that I think are also very targeted to the population. I think that oftentimes when I was going to mass, we would go to wherever was maybe most convenient or more of like a family parish, but it's been very helpful to go to a parish that is more focused on young adults. And I think that his homilies definitely kind of reflect that week to week, and is talking about things that we're going through in this generation. And I think that being able to kind of, rediscover that role that priests do have of being mentors and spiritual guides in our community. And, whether that be seeing him at events or being able to talk to him one-on-one about different things. I think that that's been helpful, just finding this thing that's already kind of baked into the Catholic community, whether it be the older members in your parish, or the priest himself. I think that those are two areas that helped. Or even in the men's Bible group too, there are guys that are like fresh out of college, like have been doing this for 10 years. So I think that those communities kind of help, because it's not just, your group of buddies that you're sticking with, but you're kind of opening up to the broader community.
Mm-hmm. It's funny noticing a theme, maybe besides the priestly mentorship, which I think is a great call out, but to notice a theme of what men's groups form around. And this is something that I've heard talked about before, but men's groups typically form around like an activity. So you mentioned like Exodus 90. So like there's an activity that you guys are all kind of doing, and then simultaneously you're having conversations and you're building the fraternity. Or there's the Bible study, which is the activity, and then simultaneously there's the ability to come together and share your experiences. And I found that to be really helpful in thinking about how to create spaces for guys to interact with each other, is to kind of focus on or look to join a activity that you're going to, and then in that activity kind of experience or expect to have that camaraderie. Versus, I think, going back to maybe the differences between men and women, I think women are more comfortable meeting with the intention to talk, whereas men kind of want to meet and then be beside another guy doing another thing, and then, oh, by the way, here's my story. So that's interesting to see that theme even in the experiences that you had.
Yeah, no, I definitely relate to that a lot. And that was something that, as I was thinking about the different Catholic communities that I've been in, that kind of was a line between them, just being like, yeah, we were always kind of doing something. We were always kind of like activity or goal oriented, whether it be the swim team kind of, having a whole season build up to a championship, or I was also part of the debate team in high school, and just kind of having that shared experience of like doing research and going to competitions and staying up late and traveling to tournaments and stuff, just kind of gives you this shared set of experiences that you're able to bond over in the moment, and then afterwards just find very rewarding, even when they were very difficult. And I think that, part of what can be both challenging but also very good about Catholic communities, and especially these kinds of groups that are more faith based, is that it does kind of require you, by the structure of it, I think, to be honest with yourself, and then to then be able to kind of fully participate with other people. So, whether it be interpreting the Bible or sharing your experiences with Exodus, it kind of, in order to do the thing, you kind of have to not necessarily be distracted or just focused on the activity, but like do that internal work, and being honest with yourself to be able to fully participate and engage and get the most out of it. So I think in a lot of different, I think I've heard this line in general, that like you get what you put into it. And I think that that's very true with Catholic communities, because beyond just like, okay, we're doing something or we're playing a sport or we're working out, like there is an element of the more open and honest you are with yourself and with God, the more you can kind of grow in that. So it kind of, I think, creates a good virtuous cycle of forcing you to kind of, work on yourself, for lack of a better term, in order to kind of be in this community. And it's not in a way that feels like pressure or feels like competitive. It's just kind of like you're forming those bonds over the fact that you're all kind of trying to get to this point of like growing spiritually. And I think that, in today's culture, there's a lot of general like, people want to work on themselves or improve. And I think that's not a bad thing, but it doesn't seem to oftentimes be tied with that community element. So it can be like, okay, I'm going to work out, or I'm going to cook and be healthier, or I'm going to do like ice baths or something, but you're not doing it like with other people, which makes it harder for those things to stick. Whereas, if you're with a group of guys and you're all taking cold showers for 90 days, and it's with a goal that's not just, for the health benefits or for, something that maybe you need at some point in your life, but won't later. I think it kind of helps to orient that experience towards the highest, and towards worship and the spiritual life. So I think I've just found that very fruitful, that you're both kind of doing something which is very much like in the vein of the natural building blocks, I think, for male community, but it takes that and kind of makes it in a way that also like helps you to grow in your faith and to improve in areas of life that you maybe wouldn't have noticed before.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned Exodus 90 and the cold plunges, which I think is hilarious, and I love the quote that you'll often see on the internet of the hardest thing about doing a cold plunge is not mentioning it on social media, which I think is completely true. Have you found that there's a connection or maybe a correlation between kind of like the sacrifice that you've experienced with other men or doing an activity and the bonds that are formed in that? Because there are a lot of different things, like you've mentioned, swim team, it's hard physical activity. Exodus 90 contains the ascetical practices, obviously on purpose.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that's something that men should kind of think about when, considering kind of joining groups or looking for groups to join, is the benefit maybe that a sacrificial activity could have more so than maybe just a comfortable neutral activity?
Yeah. I mean, I think that it does just, I think to that point of like, it opens you up to being like a little bit more honest with yourself, especially when it's like an act of penitence. I think that it can kind of be a building block there in general. Like you could have like a local sports team that you're a part of that helps you to cultivate that bond. And I think there maybe is something very like, ancient, like primitive built into that, whether it be the fact that like men had to go hunt together, like fight in wars together, like you kind of have this like archetype throughout history. But I think it's like the fact that it was kind of oriented towards the same goal is what helps to unify it. It's that you're kind of sacrificing for a goal together. And I think that now there's not that many things that you necessarily need to sacrifice to get in general. Like you don't have to go hunt to go get food or war to like defend your family or community or something. So I think in an era where we have a lot of comforts in the world and don't necessarily have to, it does, I think, add an extra layer because you can be doing other things, but they won't necessarily have that like common good behind them, or it's just limited to that thing. Whereas I think when it is an act of penance or it is kind of oriented more spiritually, then it can have, I think, more fruits in terms of just forming a spiritual bond rather than just like a friendship where you kind of understand that struggle that someone else went through in their faith too. And I think that, I think kind of when I was coming back to it, to the faith, it was kind of difficult even at the Newman Center because I wasn't doing something like that. It was just kind of like the more social aspects. And there was a group of guys that was doing Exodus 90. I just hadn't gotten into that at the time. But I think that even those very fruitful, it was kind of like, I would almost even think to myself, like, how did they get there? Right? Like how are they now doing Exodus 90? Like, how have they kind of gone through this throughout all of college? Like, it did kind of make it a little bit harder to open up about those kinds of things. Whereas I think that when you're doing it and kind of acknowledging, like, yeah, this is really difficult. It can be very difficult to like get your daily prayer in every day or to really stick with your Lenten disciplines. So I think that it kind of helped to almost like break through that barrier that, like we were talking about, like women can kind of just more easily talk about these things and open up about these things in their social environments. Whereas for men, I think it's until you kind of are doing something together and kind of acknowledge between each other, like, yeah, this is tough. Yeah, I think it can open up more of that path. Or even as I'm thinking, like, the swim team was really great, but I think that part of what made it even better and more of a bonding experience wasn't just the fact that it's like, oh well, we all swam together and had this like kind of tough physical thing to do, because I think there were obviously other men's swim teams in high school that like went through a similar thing. And the sport is divided into like men's and women's, so you still do kind of primarily have a little bit of separation in those spaces. But for example, we would have a yearly retreat at the beginning of the year over Labor Day. And the thing that I think really kind of cemented that bond for the season was that all of the seniors would give like a 10-15 minute talk about like what the swim team had meant to them and their experience with it. So it wasn't just like, oh, this guy is like really fast and I swam in the pool with him and we did laps together and we kind of had this experience to bond over. It was also that like they would open up at the beginning of the year and be like, yeah, I'm a senior and I've thought about quitting like many times and this hasn't been easy. And, the personal things that they had been through too. And also just kind of talking about how their friendships with the other guys on the swim team were what kept them coming back or that helped them through those difficult moments. So I do think that there is something to kind of that difficulty to then be able to open up about why it's difficult and to see that and acknowledge that, because oftentimes I think between men it can be a competition where you're trying to outdo each other, or I could imagine in a gym context or something, you're trying to get more reps in and more lifts in than the other person. But when you kind of have to acknowledge like, yeah, this is tough and open up about it and have conversations, I think that those more penitential aspects of it, like everyone struggles with them. So it kind of grounds that experience beyond just like, are you good at this sport or are you good at this thing that we're doing together, to this is something that everybody's going to struggle with.
Thank you for watching The Making of Man. If you liked that episode, please click here for more, and remember to like and subscribe.